As they finalize getting everything set, just greet you a happy afternoon and let you know that maybe what the organizers were expecting and what you were expecting when they invited a physical activity person to talk here might be a little bit different. I don't want to tell you so much about how physical activity is good for you, why it's good for you, how much you should do. But the sense I got from Dr. Sharma's presentation and doing other symposiums such as this in the past is that people who show up to these symposiums are quite educated. They know physical activity is good for them. They've had 20 different people in their lives tell them that it's good for them. They know it brings down their blood sugars and all sorts of health benefits. So what I want to do is take a bit of time to share with you some of the things that we're doing here in Edmonton, in Alberta, specifically within the Alberta Diabetes Institute. And I've only been at the U of A for 6 years, and I still think I'm the youngest of all researchers within the Alberta Diabetes Institute. And I really have to say that the funding that I've received from them to help some of my ideas get off the ground, to do some pilot projects, has really been instrumental to start my career. So I'd want to share with you some of these projects, one that finished about 2 years ago, and the other one that's underway right now. And at the end, I'd probably take a few minutes to share the exciting news with you about the new Physical Activity and Diabetes Center or laboratory that we're building here in the city of Edmonton, and tell you a bit about the type of projects that we'd like to do. There are two studies I wanted to talk about. One of them was finished about a year or two ago, and it's a study looking at how exercise and metformin work together. And the other study is a study that's currently underway that's looking at different types of exercise and how we can lose fat, in particular abdominal fat, which is more strongly related to type 2 diabetes. So that one doesn't have too many results because it's currently underway, but you might find it interesting to see what we're doing. Exercise and weight loss has a bit of a love-hate relationship in some ways. Many people on TV, even healthcare professionals, when you tell them you're trying to lose weight, will strongly encourage exercise for weight loss. But most studies that look at exercise and weight loss find that a typical exercise program of 30, 45 minutes a session for 3-4 sessions a week don't actually lead to that much weight loss. Anybody have an idea of how much, if you're going to do 45 minutes walking 3 times a week, how much weight loss typically happens after 6 months?
None.
5 pounds? Some
None.
people say none.
None.
So it's nothing like the 20 or 30 pounds that we hear on TV. Your experience, I even ask my students in kinesiology, the future teachers of this to the population, and they're always telling me 20, 30 pounds and things like that. It's not realistic. People have really exaggerated expectations of how much weight we can lose with exercise. However, there's something that I'm working on that I find is interesting on physical activity and what's known as visceral fat. So people store fat in many different areas. The typical male pattern of fat deposition is in the abdominal area, but it doesn't just happen in males. Females store fat there as well, particularly after menopause. And if you look at this image, a slice taken across the belly, if it would have been a slightly different height, you would have seen the person's belly button around there. This is his or her six-pack covered with a little bit of fat. The spine is there, muscle in red. Fat is all the yellow part. People will call these love handles, if you will. But you see that there's not only fat on the outside, but we store fat within the abdominal cavity. This is what people talk about when they talk about visceral fat. And unfortunately, even if it's hard to lose this fat, and most people want to lose subcutaneous fat because they don't want it to hang and they want to look better, but this is the fat that's most strongly associated with type 2 diabetes. The reasons for that aren't fully understood, but if you look at this other, not a real image, but a cartoon kind of showing, a lot of this fat is around the intestines and in the abdominal cavity, and it drains directly to your liver. Your liver is an important organ in diabetes that produces glucose. It has all sorts of functions, and that's one of the reasons why they think that this intra-abdominal fat is so dangerous. So the question is, even with exercise, even if it leads to very little weight loss, is there any ways that with exercise we could target this bad fat, as you would call it, and lead to more weight loss from this area? Well, before I answer that, let me just say that maybe 10 years ago that was maybe considered to be a foolish thought. How can you specifically tell fat where to come from and be burnt? Well, the diabetes story and the glitazones, I think people mentioned Advandia in that earlier presentation, is an example of it. This class of diabetes medication has shown to us that it is possible to specifically target the intra-abdominal area here. This is a study published a few years back, about 10 years ago. Not the best example perhaps here, but you see overall in this lady who started taking this medication, her visceral fat area did not change, but she put on a lot of subcutaneous fat after, I think, 6 months of treatment. 6 months of treatment with this diabetes medication. On average, for the whole study, people lost about 20% of their visceral fat. So the intra-abdominal fat, they lost 20% of it. Unfortunately, this medication leads to weight gain, and they gained about 15% more in their subcutaneous fat. So it's kind of a good story. Yes, they lost the bad fat, but unfortunately, they gained some of the other fat. So we know that there are different signaling, different communication pathways that lead to that can determine where fat loss comes from. Does it come from intra-abdominally or subcutaneous? Can exercise target the intra-abdominal fat? And what I did with a summer student who was working with me, we decided to look at every exercise study that had ever been done and that measured intra-abdominal fat. And there was 20, 30 of them out there. We do a lot of studies in this field. And some lost lots of visceral fat, some didn't lose much visceral fat, but it seemed that those that did the higher intensity exercise, I know a lot of people don't like the term higher intensity exercise, it's intimidating, but it seemed that the higher intensity exercise led to more of a loss in the intra-abdominal fat. There was only one study at the time that actually compared this LIET as low intensity exercise training to high intensity exercise training. So they had one group of each, they randomly assigned people to each group, and what you see is, I don't want to get into the statistics part, but the high intensity group had about a 15% loss in their visceral fat, whereas the low intensity group, it was about a 5% loss. So this one was different than zero, but there was not a real difference. It didn't reach statistical significance, which researchers often use. It didn't reach statistical significance. However, and when I made my point to the ADI and the ADF for funding for this study, for our study, this was the point I brought to them. If you look at the low intensity group, their walking speed was 3.4 miles an hour. And in the high intensity group, they did some low intensity and some high intensity, and the high intensity was 3.7 miles an hour. So really, despite very little difference between both groups, you're starting to see a trend. So what I propose to do is, let's see what happens if we make people exercise really at a higher intensity. Can we target that visceral fat depot? And I'll show you some of the preliminary results here. First, let me show you what I did as a high-intensity program. We recruited, currently there are 7 people enrolled in the study. We're going to have another 12 starting after Christmas, and we're still recruiting, so if people are interested, I'll show you my email again and let me know. But basically, we take sedentary people, and we ask them to participate in 30 minutes of biking or walking Monday, Wednesday, Friday for 2 weeks. Those that want to continue were then randomized to the high-intensity group and the traditional intensity group. The traditional intensity is regular walking or pedaling on a stationary bike at a low intensity. The high-intensity group, both groups actually, they progressed from 30 minutes to 60 minutes, and they were exercising every day of the week. This is probably more than the actual Canadian Diabetes Association recommendations, which are 150 minutes a week. By the end, they're doing 60 minutes 5 times a week, so they're doing twice as much as what's recommended. So I'm not saying you have to do this amount, but we want to see changes in weight loss, so we tried to a pretty intense intervention. The term high intensity is scary to many people, but it's actually a lot of our people in our high intensity group, after having done it, tell me that they actually prefer it to low intensity or the regular intensity. Let me show you what we did. 100% of what the term that exercise people call a VO2 max. Your VO2 max is an intensity that if I would have you walk on a treadmill at this intensity, you'd probably only be able to walk for 3 or 4 minutes at that intensity before saying, I can't continue anymore. In the low intensity or traditional intensity group, we had him walk at about 40% of this. That is a slow walk, slow or moderate speed walk for most people. In the high intensity group, they did 100% of this. But instead of doing it for their maximum of 3 or 4 minutes, they only did it for 1 minute. So these people could do it for 3 or 4 minutes, but we just make them do it for 1 minute because they get the hormonal changes, the insulin changes, the adrenaline changes that you would get from those high intensities. And then we make them recover for 3 minutes at 20%. This is a really slow recovery speed. It's slower than you normally walk when you're walking the dog or in the mall. It's a very slow speed. This averages out to this same energy expenditure. That's the nice thing about our study. Both groups are doing the exact same amount of calories that they're burning. The preliminary results, unfortunately, the first participants are only going to do their scan of their abdominal area on Thursday of this week, so I don't have the first results for visceral fat for you. But I've got lots of results on how their glucose changed. But to date, and this is really amazing, I've never seen this in any of my exercise studies before. One of the concerns with doing this is people said, no one's going to do your program, Norm. It's crazy to exercise an hour 5 times a week. I know it's a little extreme, but we've got great participants, and to date, they've all completed 8 to 12 weeks of this. Of 331 potential exercise sessions, we have a 99% adherence rate. These guys are here day after day. If they miss, they'll go exercise on the weekend and tell me they're really, really motivated people with diabetes. And I think we often characterize, this is what this reminds me of, we often think diabetes, these people are sedentary, they don't do anything, they can't do anything. They can. A lot of people with diabetes are more active than the regular population, walk more than the regular population, and they still have diabetes. So it was really interesting to see that it's possible. I'm not saying that it's for everyone. A lot of people may have knee problems and might not be able to do this type of exercise, but it's possible for some. Overall, from, let's say they come into exercise, we take a finger prick of their blood sugar. These people are relatively well controlled. Their blood sugar is around 8.8, maybe a little higher than yours, maybe a little lower, depending on how you are. By the end of their 30 or 45 minutes or hour of exercise, depending on what time it was, it goes down to 7.2. So you're seeing a really significant drop. And this was the same in the high intensity and the low intensity group. I don't know if you're aware of this, but 20 years ago, people would discourage high-intensity activity in people with diabetes. They would tell people with diabetes not to do resistance training as well because they think it would increase their blood sugar. That might be the case in type 1 diabetes if they don't have enough insulin, or in some cases, but in type 2 diabetes, doesn't seem to be the case. And actually, some of our studies looking at resistance training versus aerobic training have suggested that resistance training is just as good as aerobic training almost. And it happens to some of our participants too. I don't have the answer exactly to why this happens. One of the things that that seems to be the case is the lower it starts with, if it starts off pretty low, meaning maybe someone hasn't eaten in a long time or their medications has brought it low, and then you start exercising as a bit of a defense mechanism. If your blood maybe was at 8.8 and then it goes to 7.2, your system is sensing that your blood sugars are getting lower. And to protect from getting too low, we get our counter-regulatory hormones that secrete. And so we found this with a lot of our participants, mostly during the first weeks as they exercise, they'd have this increase. Yeah. But as time went on, and especially if they exercise after a meal as opposed to more in a fasting state or a long time after a meal. So when they exercise after a meal, when their sugar started high, they would tend to go down quite a bit. And the other thing to see is how your fasting glucose react as well. This is what happened from before to right after exercise. There's 2 hours after. What I have in the graph here is what their fasting sugars were like. And these are everyone together, high and low intensity group. They responded quite similarly. And at the beginning of the study, their fasting sugars were around 10. After a couple weeks, it starts going down, and by the end of this week 8 here, their fasting sugars are around 8. So we see that, during the first couple weeks, maybe not much happened to their fasting sugars, but in time, things continue to improve. So hopefully in a year's time, when you hear me speak again, I'll have some more interesting results on what happened to the visceral fat. Based on the preliminary studies, I'm thinking that we'll have a greater loss in visceral fat, but that still remains to be seen. Yes? I would say yes and no. For most people with type 2 diabetes, I wouldn't necessarily recommend having a snack on hand during and after. As the body's adjusting, if you're measuring your blood sugars, or especially if you're taking insulin, or you're on some of the medications that Dr. Sharma suggested that in a way to illustrate, squeeze out more insulin out of your pancreas, there are more chances of getting into hypoglycemia, so carrying snacks around might be a good idea. However, the precaution I have is when we do studies, weight loss studies in people who don't have diabetes, we often see that our exercise studies, they lose, and they do quite a bit of exercise, watch their diet, they're losing 5, 6, 7 pounds. In people with diabetes, they do the same exercise programs and they don't lose any weight at all. And sometimes they're gaining weight because they have a fear of hypoglycemia. And so they tend to want to eat more during or after exercise to prevent hypoglycemia. So my concern is how far we take this eating with exercise to prevent hypoglycemia. And that's the concern, I think, that comes from the history of a lot of the research in exercise and diabetes in maybe 40, 50, 60 years ago started in type 1 diabetes, whereas now in type 2 diabetes, depending on what medication you're on, you might not have any risk of hypoglycemia. So eating additional food is just going to stop any little weight loss that you may have from exercise. Another excellent question. Do you get used to the exercise? Typically, what I've seen with aerobic training, such as walking and biking, is that most of the benefits on your A1C or on the sugars will be obtained in the first 3 to 6 months. And you're right, if you don't keep doing more, like I said, most of us aren't going to lose a ton of weight, so you're not losing any weight anymore, your sugars aren't going to continue getting better. They kind of stabilize. So that might be the case with aerobic exercise. So if you want to get additional benefits, you got to have to keep doing more. Same argument I'd make with the medication. You start taking a pill, after a while things get better, they're going to stabilize and eventually might start creeping up again. So exercises like that pill where you eventually have to take more and more of it. However, that might not be the case for resistance training. As muscle mass continues to increase and you continue to get stronger and stronger and lifting more weights, the benefits seem to perhaps continue, but we haven't really done any resistance training studies that are past 6 months to a year, so I don't know how long that continues for.
How do you measure the visceral fat?
That's the problem. That's a bit of the problem we have. From a research perspective, it's a really interesting question. Can we target the bad fat? Even your doctors in clinic can't measure visceral fat. It's only in the research studies when we have people do MRI or CT scans to get a scan of their abdominal area to see how much is inside. So most of you won't know where the fat is coming from. However, what they've shown is that those people who lose a lot of their waist circumference, so when you see your belt getting looser and you have to get another notch in your belt or it's very strongly associated with the amount of visceral fat you lose. So another reason for while you're exercising, especially if you're increasing your muscle mass, which is not going to be a dramatic change, but that weighing yourself on the scale might not be the best indication of how much improvements you're having. It might be more how your clothes fit around the abdominal area. All very good questions. It looks like they wrapped up on the other side, so I just want to show you some of the exciting news about the Physical Activity and Diabetes Laboratory that is going to be completed within the next year right here in Edmonton near the University of Alberta. There's an Earl's restaurant right here at the corner of 87th Ave and 112th Street is where the Alberta Diabetes Institute is. And right now, for the studies that I've just described now, we're actually going out into public facilities, having a hard time to find a room to sneak to take blood samples, paying an arm and a leg either for memberships or if where we get it for free, they're restricting our hours, we're going to work out. So we're going to want to do larger studies such as these. And within the next year, this physical activity center is going to be developed. There's going to be a place to exercise, change rooms, a place for more taking blood and doing more research studies, and my office and other offices will be there. So it's going to be pretty an exciting time about the type of research we're going to be doing. Just want to share a bit with you. The vision that we have is to optimize the use of physical activity for the prevention and management of diabetes. And so these are the types of studies that I'd like to do. I've got some colleagues, they kind of joke around and say, Norm, you work from neck down. You're interested in exercise physiology. They work from the neck up. They're interested in behavior, changing environments in the healthcare system, changing motivation, improving motivation. So we'll have all that research happening there. And one of the things I think that we can really do with this physical activity center is be a face that links the Alberta Diabetes Institute, the Alberta Diabetes Foundation to the community by giving opportunities for exercise, interacting with diabetes education centers, providing them education. One of the things we'd like to do is, it's a nice, huge facility, but there are 5% of the Edmonton population that has diabetes. We only have 6 treadmills. It's far, not everyone can go there, but we'd like to develop link with physical activity centers, walking programs throughout the community, always in a research capacity, but trying to promote physical activity in different ways. So if ever you have the opportunity to participate in some of our studies, or we'll be working with people who may have more advanced questions or concerns with their diabetes and exercise, this will be the place to do it.